We're also joined today by artist Kit Wise on Election Day in Tassie, and climate scientist and artist David Karoly. And then, after we all speak for 10 minutes or so, we'll take some questions. So, just by way of background, in my work at CLIMART, Arts for a Safe Climate, we've worked with the University of Melbourne as a knowledge partner to understand and access the sciences, particularly as they relate to climate change. It was, dare I say it, a bit of a revelation to me, a bit revelatory, when I started working at CLIMART in 2013, that I realised that scientists and artists have much in common and both see themselves as creatives. I began to understand that it is only in recent times, really, that the arts and sciences have been so separately siloed. The arts and sciences don't work in a vacuum. They work in a highly globalised context and they operate in the time and place in which we live. This is why so many artists are turning their attention to environmental concerns, because of the great body of irrefutable science on our changing climate, amongst other things, and they want to do something about it. And it is why so many in the scientific community look to creative communication to endeavour to get traction outside of the academy, particularly, for example, with government agencies. But what about communication, and can a collaboration between the arts and sciences help us communicate critical issues that we must face and urgently act upon? All of us here on this panel are extremely concerned with the unfolding climate crisis. It's incredibly serious. Because it's worth remembering that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, warns that we have 9 years to act to limit warming to no more than a 1.5°C temperature rise, but sadly, we're not going to make it. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels alone are at 418 parts per million. We're already at a 1.2°C temperature rise above pre-industrial levels. At 480 parts per million, 350 being considered safe. I know I'm talking only about CO2 here, but when we reach 1.5, this means that the Great Barrier Reef is pretty much gone. And as the great marine biologist Terry Hughes is quoted in a recent essay in the Griffith Review, he explains his grief is like walking through the Louvre and watching everything burn down before your very eyes. In Australia, bushfire, flood, cyclones and drought are ravaging our country like never before. 9 of Australia's 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 2005. Australia's emissions are tracking at the highest on record, according to new data from the emissions tracking organisation Endeavour Environmental. Australia is not on track to meet its Paris commitments. Fun times. We are living, as Elizabeth Colbert coined, the 6th extinction. It seems almost surreal to know that koalas are now endangered. Over 1 billion animals died in the summer fires of 2019-2020. And we know that we have entered a proposed new epoch of the Anthropocene, the term coined by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer in 2000, which recognises that the collective actions of human activity has substantially altered the Earth's surface, atmosphere and oceans. But at CLIMART, we take the view that global warming was never only a technical problem. We see it as a social and cultural problem. The reality is, and you know what we've seen in the last 20 years, is that scientific facts and figures used importantly to define the problem often fail to move people to concern or action. At CLIMART, we believe that art can not only show, but importantly can make us feel the problems we are facing. It can enable us to imagine possible responses and visualise possible futures. We believe that the arts can create the empathy, there's an overused word at the moment, we need to lead us to action. They can motivate us to act with purpose, to potentially create better outcomes. They can inspire us to acknowledge that we are part of nature and not separate from it. Indeed, they have the capacity to re-enchant us, as detailed in Susie Gablick's profound book, The Re-Enchantment of Art, with our world, and do what the arts do best: lift our spirits, inspire and engage. Or as Albert Camus stated in his final essay, Create Dangerously, we can no longer just be the spectators, we have to row the boat. Creative thinking and expression by artists helps us to understand the profound relationship which exists between all living things. For these are the relationships that make our world the wondrous experience that it is. Over the past few years, curators and arts producers have been increasingly drawn to environmental aesthetics. At CLIMART, we collaborate with a wide range of artists, arts professionals, scientists and policy experts to produce what we hope are compelling programs for change. Human-induced climate change poses enormous risks to our world and to us. Now more than ever, we feel it's creative voices that are required to act as powerful change makers. It is this engagement that CLIMART seeks to encourage and energise, because it's really time to face our possible futures and choose which one we want for ourselves and for all life on Earth. The artists gathered here have worked with scientists, policy experts and developed their own research and artworks contemplating societal collapse, species extinction, pollution and deep, deep connection to nature. So let's begin. Each speaker will have around 10 minutes and I'll just introduce the speakers and all of the speakers, and after that, please make them welcome. Dr. Debbie Symons, to my right, is a multidisciplinary artist based here in Bayside. In 2014, she completed her PhD in fine art in drawing at the Faculty of Art and Design, Monash University, and it was entitled Anthropocentrism, Endangered Species and the Environmental Dilemma. She is currently an associate in the School of Art with the College of Design and Social Context at RMIT. Symons utilises a range of mediums to communicate central themes in her work, which includes humanity's complicated relationship with the natural environment, the dynamics of the global political economy, and the effects of consumer culture. With a very strong research base in contemporary science, Symons collaborates with scientific organisations such as the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species and numerous scientists. Debbie Symons and I have a long association. Symons exhibited in our first iteration of CLIMART's Art Plus Climate Equals Change Festival that led to an invitation to participate in Art COP 21 in Paris, which is the artistic response to the Conference of the Parties, and we exhibited your work. We all went together, Nature Mort, Counting 1 to 4. Most recently, Symons participated in the prestigious Lab Verde Art Immersion program in the Amazon. Seeing is an outcome of the Lab Verde residency, where she saw the nests of the yellow-rumped, how do I say that bird again? Cacique, precariously suspended over the flooded forests within the Amazon jungle. Right. So Kit Wise, joining us by Zoom here, is a leading Australian artist, art writer and curator. He's held numerous exhibitions in Australia, America and Italy, and exhibited in group exhibitions in Australia, Asia and Europe. He has published numerous articles, reviews, book chapters and catalogue essays, including texts for Australian and international art journals such as Frieze and Un magazine. He is currently the Dean of the School of Art at RMIT University and is a long-time friend and colleague of Dr. Debbie Symons, and wrote the excellent catalogue essay for Sing. David Karoly, to my left, and in my view, a national living treasure, and the leader of Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub in the Australian Government's National Environmental Science Program based at CSIRO. He is also an honorary professor at the University of Melbourne. He is the internationally recognised expert on climate change and climate variability. During 2012 to 2017, David was a member of the Climate Change Authority, which provided advice to the Australian Government on responding to climate change, including targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You were, in fact, the last scientist standing on that, weren't you not? Yeah. He's been involved in the assessment reports of the IPCC in 2001, 2007, 2014 and 2021. And he's been awarded numerous awards. From 2007-2018, David Karoly was the Professor of Atmospheric Science at the University of Melbourne. David has been heavily involved in public communication of climate change science with groups within the arts, such as CLIMART and also Tipping Point Australia. In 2019, he held 2 joint exhibitions with artist Peter Burham at Frankston Arts Centre and Walker Street Gallery in Dandenong, entitled "Only When the Last Tree Has Died Will We Realise We Cannot Eat Money." Please make our speakers welcome.
Hello. Firstly, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Bayside Gallery for hosting this event, and then also the amazing panelists that are around me and the chair that we have today. These relationships are built over many, many years, and they're incredibly supportive relationships, and I value them very much. To date, Sing is my most ambitious work. 2.5 years in the making. This new work is a continuation of my research into humanity's complicated relationship with the natural environment. The work highlights a predicament of deforestation events in tropical rainforests for many bird species who live in community groups and raise families within these biodiverse environments. It seeks to question where rainforest species are to exist when their natural environment is replaced with homogeneous environments, void of the essential elements required to sustain their lives. Sing has been inspired by my 2018 residency at Le Verbe in Manaus. And as Lillian is unable to join us today, I'll give a brief overview of what the program's about. It functions as a multidisciplinary platform for the development of nature and ecology critical thinking. Artists, scientists, and other agents of knowledge come together to recognise and narrate nature in an attempt to create new ways of existing and interacting with the natural environment, as well as speculate on possible futures. The residency takes place in 2 different environments. The first is at the Ducky Reserve, just outside of Manaus, hosted within a scientific research station. Here we are immersed within the forest and learned and interacted with a range of science specialists through daily presentations or walks. We learn about the trees, birds, ants, soil and climate from passionate researchers working at the Brazilian National Institute of Amazonian Research. The program was intense, and the information shared was detailed and in many instances frightening. The second environment was on the water, and we witnessed the meeting of the waters, and that is incredible. That's 35 kilometres of 2 rivers merging together. Just incredible environment, and travelled through just a few of the thousands of estuaries. Le Verbe is unique, and the Amazon is like nothing I've experienced before. The curated immersion program merges different fields of scientific researchers and artists within the laboratory as such. And from my perspective, the program is designed to create awareness of the issues facing the Amazon and empower artists to communicate the learnings. It is designed to further the research being undertaken in this environment using artists' voices and their practices. As my practice focuses on other animals and their habitats, I was thrilled to be accepted into that program and given the opportunity to learn from the various scientific fields. Oh, sorry about that. In my PhD thesis, I focused on the positioning and coverage of scientific data. With this research beginning during the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis. Just cast your mind back to that period in time. My practice has always focused on the non-human species and their environments. However, in 2009, the placement of an article in The Age baffled me. A broadsheet newspaper at the time, the first 18 pages of the paper were dedicated to the coverage of the fall of the stock market, businesses impacted, and screenshots of men in suits watching stock fall on a share market board. And on page 19, there was an article on the findings of the Red List of Threatened Species, documenting the rapid rise of species being threatened with extinction. The article stated that the 2008 IUCN Red List of Threatened Species documented 16,928 species threatened worldwide. It was an increase of 5,882 additional species since the last Red List was printed in 2000. At the time, I questioned how the statistics highlighting such frightening loss of the natural world came second to the human construct of the financial markets. This led me to explore how scientific research was distributed and shared within political and media spheres, and ignited me to seek out and build relationships with the scientific community, with David being the first scientist I reached out to. Working with the scientific community as an artist can be seen as slightly unique. But artists have been communicating the loss of the natural world since the Romantic movement of the 1800s, with artists painting dark, murky waters being pumped out of factories and animals receding into forests. They were illuminating the changing environment around them, and in today's society, scientists are communicating the loss on a far greater scale. Therefore, in my research practice, I explore why peer-reviewed data in environmental research, such as the Red List and Living Planet Index, doesn't create the impetus to rapidly transform our societies. I basically struggle to understand how graphs stating that there's been an average drop of 68% of non-human species populations since the 1970s doesn't cause alarm. I work with scientists in the scientific community as the relationships informs my practice. The data and the statistics they developed are utilised within my works. At times, the information shared between the two disciplines is clearly defined. For example, in World Species Market, I replaced the customary data of stocks and shares and fed the data from the Red List of Threatened Species in, showing the 60 countries with the greatest loss of species. And that can be quite a direct way of using scientific data. Or I can do it quite subtly, and that's the work that you're seeing out there in Sing, where the work explores deforestation issues and the loss of habitat. I witnessed the nests of the yellow-eared sarkiekberg hanging high above the flooded forest in the second week of the Le Verbe program. Suspended in large community groups, the nests were positioned way out on the tips of branches to avoid being raided by monkeys. And underneath them, in the waters below them, were anacondas, piranhas, and a host of other bird-eating species. The nest type of the sarkiekberg bird is a pendant-type build, and this style of nest is quite common amongst tropical bird species. Even here in Australia, it's tropical forests, we have the olive sunbird, who builds their nest in this beautiful shape. The birds build their nests out of found material, and this created space becomes their home to raise their young. The nests exhibited in Sing are reflective of sarkiekberg nests, both in texture and colour. However, rather than being made of indigenous Amazonian flora, the nests in Sing have been created with African palm oil fronds, a plant being cultivated as an industrial agricultural crop following the clearing of tropical rainforests globally. To create the work, I collaborated with scientist Associate Professor Paul Nelson up in Cairns, who helped me source the palm oil fronds. Hearing the voices of the birds that live within the rainforest environments is essential to this work, and the beautiful bird calls that you can hear within the space are recorded from various tropical bird species and have been sourced from one of the scientists I met in Manaus, Dr. Mario McCrancroft. In closing, as I flew from St. Paulo to Manaus, I looked through the tiny airplane window to the ground and witnessed many, many agricultural and livestock paddocks cut into the Amazon rainforest, with a forest edge surrounded by these fields of crops within the dense forest scouring the landscape. Deforestation throughout the world's primary forest sees a football field removed every 6 seconds. The outlook for all species, if we maintain the current trajectory, is incredibly grim. And the information that supports this work, and many of my other works, is not propaganda. They are sourced from peer-reviewed data compiled by thousands of scientists imploring governments, leaders and consumers to change. Therefore, my art looks at the ways we can communicate what the scientists are telling us with greater urgency every day. They're designed to create an emotional response. In closing, the tropical rainforests hold within the richest biodiversity on the planet, and today there are so few areas remaining. They are environments that sustain other species whose lives are similar to ours, with family and community being central to their existence. Throughout history, the arts have played a major role in recording and reflecting the state of human society and its relationship with the natural world. But sometimes we've also needed the arts to be a catalyst for change.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Deb. And I understand that Australia is in the top 10 of countries who are cutting down deforestation. We're in the top 10 now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So over to you, Kit, on the screen.
Thank you, Bronwyn. And I'm hoping you can hear me as well as see my lips moving.
Can you hear?
Is the audio okay at your end? And I'll try and speak a little louder. Okay, thank you very much. It is an honour to be here this afternoon. Clearly, it wouldn't be COVID if somebody was on the screen. And so I hope that there is some normality in this sort of particular presence. Again, I'm hoping the audio is okay. If you can give me one more thumbs up.
Just one moment, Kit. Can everybody hear that? No or yes? Goes in and out. Can you lean closer to your microphone, Kit?
I'll give that a...
I think that, yeah.
That a little bit better.
Go ahead.
I am really honoured to be here in such esteemed company. Dr. Deb Symons is indeed one of the most impactful practitioners in this space in the country. It's an honour, Debbie, to be a witness to your work over many years. And indeed with esteemed colleagues I can see in the audience, including David, yourself. I did ask the Tasmanian government if they could move the state election to make it easier to attend in person. Sadly not possible, but I would point to the strict instructions of my 12-year-old daughter this afternoon, to vote green, Daddy, which I take as a great honour and important to have in mind in terms of why we communicate. I'm going to focus, in fact, particularly on collaboration, another thing that obviously flows from how we engage with others, but really the impacts and necessity and potential of collaboration. And there are two particular projects I'd like to focus on, both of which have a habitat focus. Much of my work in the arts, science, and often design collaboration space, in fact, aquatic themes. I'm particularly passionate about the ocean and the waters of Australia. If anybody is interested, seeing as we're in Bayside, I'm also a Brighton iceberger. I can't quite see anybody I recognise in the audience there. However, that would be the case. We usually see each other with our clothes off when we're swimming. But I did want to focus, as I say, on two particular themes around habitat, again, referring back to Debbie's work. One was a major commission for Mona, the Museum of New and Old Art here in Tasmania, that took place over a number of years, starting in 2013. And the project focused on the pollution in the River Derwent. For all of the green credentials of Tasmania and its image, the River Derwent flowing through Hobart is amongst the top 3 most polluted rivers in the world. Not far off some of the South American rivers you were close to, Debbie. There is a long history, particularly of aluminium smelting, that has had a profound legacy in terms of how it's been poorly managed in that river. Greatly changed now, but the damage has been done to such a degree. Certain communities, migrant arrivals in Tasmania who weren't familiar with that history, were eating oysters from the banks of the river and getting exceptionally ill. Mona commissioned a project across art and science and design to look at that challenge. How can we collaborate to heal the river? And the project that emerged, which also involved Debbie's work, focused on the fact that oysters, in fact, can capture and contain the heavy metal pollutions of that river safely. They extract them over time, house them in their body, and do not release them again. This led to a fascinating collaboration with the oyster industry in Tasmania, with CSIRO, who calculated how many oysters and which oysters would be best at extracting the metals, and a major installation project with a team of artists led by myself and Dr. Ross Bruin from Monash University, where I was based at the time. we established a design brief for graduating architecture students and honours fine arts students to look at how these concerns of oysters perhaps could be brought to the public as an example of biomediation. And it generated a number of things. A pavilion that was built on the grounds at Mona as a temporary project, but that was 8 years ago and is still lively and functioning. That pavilion form was based on the 7 heavy metals of the river, mercury, cadmium, etc., lead, zinc, each having a thematic presence in that pavilion. We commissioned local artisans and artists to make items using those metals. So cadmium is a very beautiful ceramics glaze, for example. There was recycled zinc sheeting housing parts of the pavilion structure. And at the heart of the pavilion was a mausoleum for oysters that had been employed to extract metals in the river. We housed them, gave them an honourable repository, if you like. That became, as I say, a pavilion, a festival focus, a shop indeed, where some of those artisan products were sold, and where the audience could engage with these thematics of heavy metal pollution in the river. That was one half of the project. The other half was a raft, in fact, a large performance space installed on the River Derwent that housed 1,000 oysters that were extracting these metals in real time. And we worked with CSIRO and the oyster industry to have cameras that were recording, believe it or not, oyster heartbeats, which is one way of measuring their response to not just toxicity in the water, but various conditions of the river. Some of you will know, I didn't, that rivers breathe for a 24-hour cycle. They inhale for 6 hours, I think during the night, and exhale during the day as algae, etc., converts the oxygen into CO2. And that data started to be fed in real time through to the pavilion as a hub for all kinds of information and knowledge sharing. There was a particular oyster I remember that we named Pearl that became a bit of a superstar on that live video feed. But again, these were pavilion forms, festival forms. They were spaces where emerging architects and emerging practicing artists could learn to collaborate, could learn to speak data, to test each other's ideas. The ideas, in fact, to bring oysters into the river came from the artists after hearing presentations from CSIRO colleagues. And that opportunity for disciplines to listen to each other and hopefully therefore to innovate, to think in new ways, often driven by the new languages and understandings they've shared, I think is one of the fundamental reasons for bringing art and science together. And if I can point to a theoretical model there, humanism, of course, encourages us to flatten the hierarchies between ourselves and what I'll call the natural world. Of course, we're all part of nature, but to no longer see us as anthropocentric, as humans leading this environmental challenge. And I think that idea of flattening hierarchies is also an important one to bring even the hierarchies of disciplines, of art and science and design and architecture, etc. And that's also been one of the learnings from that project. The other project I want to speak to, which is also a habitat-based project, and Bronwyn, I did warn you I'm an academic, so please let me know if we're going over time. The other project was also based in Tasmania and was called Species Hotels. This was again a 3 project. In fact, it's still ongoing. It was funded by the Ian Potter Foundation as a special project outside of their usual grant schemes because they were so excited by the potential, which is very encouraging. And just on that point, funding mechanisms for interdisciplinary or art-science collaborations are sadly few and far between. The resources, the guidelines, even the structures that enable this collaboration sometimes aren't easy to find. And so it's interesting, I think, that this was an atypical grant project, how this one emerged. Anyway, what was it? So again, it was looking at, in this case, the decimation of the central Tasmanian landscape through farming, colonial farming, with the arrival of white settlers on Lutruwita. Indigenous fire practices had maintained a very delicate ecosystem and agricultural approach, which was grotesquely damaged by the arrival of cloven-hooved animals and intensive agricultural practices, to such a degree that the heart of Tasmania now does not provide the habitat for the native species. There are pockets in the east and the west that are impoverished, and because of their isolation, the gene pool is dropping at an alarming rate. Greening Australia has been working in Tasmania for around 10 years on a greening project, building bridges of native habitat to link east and west. And the proposal was to establish a sculpture park at the heart of Tasmania, somewhere called Ross, that would be a focal point of this practice, of the need to re-establish habitat. And so the sculpture park needed to function as habitat. A very interesting project. So we collaborated with, again, colleagues from CSIRO, who gave us the brief, the framework with which to design what essentially looked almost like trees, but also functioned as furniture, not just for insects, birds, marsupials, but also for humans. So the sculpture park is along the banks of the River Ross, where it gets its name from, of course, donated by one of the agricultural community, a family who arrived and can trace their history back to the first colonial settlers. Land that was given to this project in recompense and in a sense to try and readdress some of the damage that had been done. Bronwyn, you're going to tell me I'm over time.
Yes. Yes. But where can we find that project? Is it online, Species Hotel? Because it was at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery,
I'll happily send some links.
Right.
To conclude,
Yeah,
again, the projects involve not just art and science, but also PhD students in public art, first-year architecture students, but most importantly, primary school students from the local Campbelltown High School, primary school. Those students just want to dwell on, we call them the little architects. They made their own designs, their own habitat forms. And they've grown up watching the big architects install and construct these projects. And they're now forming their own bird spotting clubs based at these buildings and writing back and telling us about the habitat that is coming to the area. And again, I just want to finish on that point. Communication isn't just to ourselves and to our peers and to other disciplines, it's so much to the next generation. And of course, to listen to the next generation as we think about solutions.
Thank you very much, Kit. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Bronwyn. So is this one on and can you hear it? Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to try to squeeze in everything you need to know about climate change science in 10 minutes by not talking about climate change science for most of the 10 minutes. Because all you need to know about climate change science is really able to be fitted into about 1 minute. So I'm going to spend 8 minutes or so talking about the value of collaboration between arts and science and collaboration on all sorts of different areas. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background about my connections with Bayside and my connections with the environment, which most people won't be aware of. But I worked with Bronwyn, as she started to say, in Art plus Climate equals Change in 2014 when it was just starting, or 2015 maybe, the first exhibition, and then I skipped 2017 because I was on leave. 2019 again, I was involved in CLIMART, the group that essentially spawned Art plus Climate equals Change. I think, Debbie, I met you first at RMIT and then through your exhibition at the University of Melbourne, where you had an an exhibition and a preparation material and a workshop in the Carlton Connect building at the University of Melbourne, and that's a few years ago now. But my first engagement with art and science was probably even before that, with an organisation called Tipping Point Australia. And I got involved in, if you like, art and science because it was clear to me that my interests in climate change, no matter how hard and often I talked with the general public or politicians or even through the media, were not penetrating the barriers that most people had that prevented them with understanding or accepting the science or understanding the simple messages. So it became clear that art and exhibitions provides a really important and simple space for communicating in much simpler forms than equations the importance of climate and art and the environment in messages that are simpler to understand. So while you won't see me talking about equations anymore, it's easy to understand some of the impacts by going to the exhibitions that Debbie has used or that Art Plus Climate Equals Change has used. But what about me and Bayside? Well, I had all my secondary school years here at Brighton High School in Marriage Road, and then was there also living in East Brighton for my university years. And it was in my university years, and also probably while I was sort of later secondary school, that I got really involved in spending as much time as possible outside East Brighton and getting into the countryside, into the mountains, into the oceans as often as I could, because I realised that while I needed to live within the urban environment with my parents at the time, I became fascinated by the processes that determine and control variability in the environment and changes in the environment. And that's where I learnt about the sorts of natural environments, the plants, the animals, the birds, the fishes, all of the things that traditional custodians have been looking after for thousands of generations in Australia, and which European settlers have managed to destroy relatively effectively over the last 200 years. And as we've heard from Debbie already, there has been massive destruction and extinctions of indigenous species around the world. And unfortunately, there are two things that Australia leads in. One is the rate of destruction of native species or indigenous species is higher in Australia than any other country in the world. That's not something that you want to lead in. And unfortunately, Australia is also the highest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere amongst all developed countries in the world. Two things that it would be much better to be the worst in rather than leading. I'm not allowed, because of my employment, to comment on what the Australian government could or should do in terms of addressing both those issues. I can try, if there are questions, to do that at the end. I said I was going to spend 1 minute. So Bayside and Brighton was really important for my understanding the links between science and the environment. I became interested in the arts over the last 20 years, and collaboration was important. 1 minute on climate science. Climate science is really easy. You experience it every day of the year, the weather variations you experience, the climate variations, and many of you who have lived for more than 20 years have experienced significant climate change in Australia already. Climate change is not a science problem. Climate change is a people problem. People have caused it. It is impacting people, and it's also impacting our natural environments, and that's what Debbie's exhibition is all about. People have to make decisions about whether they want to limit climate change or whether they want to try to cope. But there have been major reports over the last 20 years, including ones that talking about, and the titles are things like managing the unavoidable but avoiding the unmanageable. We need to focus on avoiding the unmanageable as well as managing the unavoidable. Last year, before he finished up as Chief Executive of BHP, the Chief Executive of BHP pointed out that the science of climate change is clear. He also pointed out that it will impact many species around the world. The planet is safe. Unfortunately, most species, including Homo sapiens, are not safe. So you need to think about the final message. And the final message is that increasing greenhouse gases directly lead to further impacts on climate change. We know that the level of global warming is directly related to cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. What does that mean? It means that we have two choices. One is to do nothing, which leads to more impacts associated with more emissions of greenhouse gases. That's a choice to make the problem worse. We have another choice, which is every single reduction of greenhouse gases by your activity, by the activities by Bayside Council, the Victorian government, the federal government, and around the world that reduces emissions, reduces global warming. Every small step is actually an important step down the road of solving climate change. So please take small steps, but they are all important. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Okay, and now we're going to take questions from the floor. I understand there is a roving mic over there. So has anybody got a question? Yes, there's one down the front.
Hi. This is directed probably to David. We've heard a lot about all the grim things that are happening in our world at the moment. Honestly, is there hope?
A very, very important question, and yes, there is hope because of that message that I tried to get across at the end. Unfortunately, every minute, every day that we delay action on climate change leads to more emissions, so things will get worse. But the really important part is every day, every time we reduce our emissions and we encourage other people and local government, state government, federal government, business and industry in Australia and around the world to reduce emissions, it reduces the ultimate magnitude of climate change. So there is good news. There are existing technologies which allow us to achieve a net zero emission economy, not only in Australia but around the world. It is a really hard problem, but we know how to fix it. And there is good news because every time we reduce emissions, we're making final levels of global warming less. So there is hope. We know how to do it. We can achieve it. The bad news is, and I should point out, I don't often get introduced as a living treasure. I've been introduced before as the scariest person at the University of Melbourne. The bad news is it's going to get a lot worse. 2019 becomes a normal climate year in Australia in the 2040s. Not an extreme hot year, a normal year in the 2040s, unfortunately.
Can I just answer something to that too? I've just been doing a bit of reading around this, and it's really hard to work and understand climate science sometimes, and on these projects. There's a fantastic book.
It's easy to understand climate science.
It's easy to understand, but it's hard to process is what I want to say. There's a great book by a psychologist by the name of Mary Pfeiffer in the States, and she talks about, it's called The Green Boat, and she talks about when they went on tar sands protests and stuff. It was a great community. A group of people went together, and all of them, when interviewed about what they felt of the day, they were all a bit sad because, you know, they didn't get as far along the line as they'd like to have. But they all went back to someone's house, had a cup of tea and a piece of cake, and were able to decompress and all work together. So where I find hope is in my kids and the galvanising activity of the school strikers, and I'd encourage everybody to stand behind those kids. If you haven't been to a rally, it is brilliant. There's another one coming up on the 21st of May, and we all have to join hand in hand and put pressure, because that's where hope resides. We have to be hopeful for the future, for future generations, but we're a bit stuck at the moment, aren't we? But we hope to get there. Look at what Biden is doing in the States. It gives you a bit of hope. Okay, would you let anybody else want to comment?
Yeah. Continue your comments about the future, all right? It's bright, it's nice, but the cost of it. Now, there are few options. One, there is a target for zero emission in 10, 15 years. I don't know how much it will cost, but probably if we close the coal and you know, the electricity, do we have the thinking of $5 per kilowatt when we have only solar you know, energy, because it costs a lot to produce it? Or on the other hand, we try to find a solution that will not have any emission, for example, nuclear energy. Why can't we do this particular one as Europe has it, hundreds of them, America, hundreds of them? No problem at all. We have land from here to eternity if somebody is afraid of any explosion like Fukushima or whatever, but it's once in a million years. Nobody speaks about it. It's cheap, it's clean, we have the resources, we have the uranium, we have everything, but sorry, people are afraid of something. I'll give you another example. Now, just one short. In Stockholm and other places in Europe, there are places that collect the garbage, the organic garbage, and burn it into energy in the middle of Stockholm. Why can't we do it here? Thank you.
Look, I could answer lots of different ways, but first of all, your solution with the Stockholm example is absolutely correct. Bioenergy is a critically important opportunity for renewable, reusable power systems. In Australia, the population has voted multiple times to say they do not want nuclear power in Australia. And the main reason is it is not cheap and it is not clean. Nuclear waste has a 100,000-year removal lifetime typically, whereas carbon dioxide only has a 10,000-year lifetime in the atmosphere in terms of cycling around. It's not my science, it's many sources of science, but we don't have time to have a debate here about that. We need to make sure that other people on the panel get a chance to talk about things as well.
I actually have two things. A quick comment for the gentleman in purple around the biomass and the energy. I work for a water utility. We're actually looking at that at the moment, running trials of, we call it waste to energy, taking biomass and converting it to energy. So actually happy to have a chat to you separately if you wanted to catch up after this. It's some very interesting work. I have a question for all the panel. I'm curious on your thoughts. For action and change, is this going to be led by the community, by private business, or by the government? Who do you actually see is doing the leading in this space?
Yeah, I actually think it's the community that will drive policy change, because the more pressure we put on politicians, the more that they actually will change. You've got to remember that I can speak freely, David can't. It's a wonderful place to be right now. You've got to understand that our government is led by the nose, by the Murdochs and the coal and the gas industry. And so they fund the government that we have in power at the moment. We have to have communities working together to change the status of our political parties and change the focus. There's so much hesitation because of how, these government parties are funded and supported. And so as more and more communities and more of these school strikes and more people rise up, it will change.
Do you want to comment, Kit?
Thank you, and I hope I can shout loudly enough through the interweb. Thank you. I want to just go back to the first question in relation to that, that sense of despair. Is there anything we can do or not? The risk of despair is that it disables the community, and that we don't feel strong enough to try. The phenomena of climate anxiety becoming documented in medical fields. I'm mindful of how we take care of community. And so this is where the well-being part, I think, isn't insignificant. How we collectively stay motivated and optimistic, I think is worth consideration.
Thank you. There's another question, lady in the red.
I would like to know the 10 commandments of what I can do as an individual. 10 commandments, please.
Well, given that there's 4 on the panel, I'm going to only do 2.5. So my 2.5 would be reduce greenhouse gas emissions in everything you do. And the next one is talk to your friends about your concerns about climate change. And the half is think about how you're voting in terms of your concerns about climate change.
Oh, we all have to jump in?
Okay.
Yeah, compost. Compost is a great one, and buy local. So when you go to the supermarket, don't buy the cherries in the middle of June from America. Don't buy the asparagus coming from Mexico. Buy what we have in season at the supermarket, or go to the farmer's market, even better.
I think I remember being at a session with the great Bruce Pascoe, who wrote the wonderful book Dark Emu, and people were asking him this very question: what can we do? He said, grow lettuce. We have to understand that at a 1.5 temperature rise, we're going to have problems with our food systems. This is why we don't need to frack, and we've got to protect land for food sources. So we have to understand that we're part of nature, not separate from it, and so everybody has to put their hands in the dirt and reconnect with nature. CLIMART's ambassador, Peter Doherty, thinks that people have lost their connection to nature. So it's really important to teach our kids, or garden, get a group together. That's really important, and join groups with local councils. Be part of a group. Don't do it on your own. It's too hard. You've got to be able to decompress and share your fears and aspirations and hopes and dreams.
Hi again. Art is a very powerful communicator, and I'm actually a student of BA Fine Arts at RMIT, second year. Hello. My question is probably to Debbie, because you mentioned community. Are there any student collaborations or international student collaborations where students can participate in getting the environmental message across?
Yes, there are, and there are at your university. Yeah, so do you mind if I point you out? So the lovely lady here, sitting here, is Linda Williams. And she has curated quite a few exhibitions at RMIT Gallery Heat. 2112. You probably know these exhibitions if you're interested. So that's the curator right there. And she runs Aegis Group, which is an art and environmental cluster at RMIT. So I would suggest you have a conversation. Yeah, passionate lady that has been supporting arts and environment studies for well over a decade. Yeah, passionate lady to speak to.
There's also a really good student-led activity or organisation, arguably the largest membership organisation in Australia, called the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, AYCC, and it has, if you like, groups at all of the universities, many of the secondary schools as well in Australia. So look up AYCC and you'll find lots of like-minded people.
Do you want to comment, Kit?
Only please do talk to Associate Professor Linda Williams. She's a world expert in this particular field. I'm honoured to say that RMIT recently was ranked 3rd in the world for its commitment to Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure David, University of Melbourne, is very close indeed as well. But the role of universities perhaps in this, when you say students, as spaces for debate, communication, new thinking, isn't insignificant either. So whether it's student groups or the groups around universities, the community collaborations, the industry collaborations we have, we need to draw on all of them to exert influence.
Okay, we got Linda. Hi. Linda's next, I think.
Okay. I've got the mic. I'm afraid I have to hold it.
I'm an artist, Carolyn Lewins, and I've worked on numerous art and science environmental projects. Many experiences were, it's very difficult to get the scientists on board, and because they're so busy. And with my colleague, Pam Kleeman, we are about to set up, in the process of setting up a sort of grassroots art and science organisation called Art Science Alliance. And we want to work with artists because they're the people we know and we have the connections with, and help them connect with scientists. So if you're not in an academic silo, it's much harder. Although I've worked in academia for a long time, I'm not there at the moment. So any advice, please?
Okay, because I've been doing this and working outside the framework of an institution with CLIMART. So how did we get all of these people on board? There's nothing like a nicely worded letter to somebody and to research about the practice. But what it seems to me, what works well, when you've got a show and say you're looking at, I don't know, just out of the top of my head, you need an expert in physics, for example, find out who's around, you know, in that faculty, but write them a nicely worded letter. And amazing things happen, and go there to them and have a cup of coffee. They're pretty generous on the whole, I found. So I would say it is just about that communication.
Yep, and it was indeed exactly how Bronwyn met me. But the other thing I would say is you probably shouldn't always plan to go to the professor. You'll actually have much more success if you go to the early career researchers, not the very, very busy and often overcommitted professors. So actually aiming what I would call early or mid-career, or even graduate students, getting them involved as well. And there is very, very strong encouragement at all of the universities for the academic, whether they're in science or whatever, academic engagement, and particularly starting that at graduate student and early career level.
Oh, do you? Okay. I want to go back to the 10 Commandments and a comment on wonderful the subtle use of palm leaves and the references to palm oil in your work, Debbie. Marvellous exhibition. But also just thinking in terms of diet more generally. We know palm oil's in a range of products. And thinking aside a little bit from fossil fuels at the moment, just thinking about the biomass on the planet and how even reducing something like meat in our diets is going to have a profound effect, and that often can come through cultural change. And it's heartening to see how vegetarianism, for example, veganism, is so much an emergent cultural change amongst young people. So if we're looking for reasons for being hopeful, I think that's one of them. Thanks.
I agree there. And in Britain, the change from moving to vegetarianism has been significant. Like the sale of meat has reduced quite a lot. We started implementing vegetarian more in our household. I have a teenage son. He's not happy with it. But you know what? I really like bean mixes and stuff like that. But yeah, you'll have protests. I think in my household it's been the teenage son, but I've just adopted it and we get along. The daughters are fine. May I just say that? How's that for the difference of the sexes? The daughters are fine.
Hi, I'll be quick. I'm Julian. I work in sustainability at Bayside City Council, which is now certified carbon neutral and has all its electricity from renewables. To answer that point. But I think you've described really well that collaboration between art and science in, I think you called it empathetic, the visceral reaction, communicating in a different language about climate science that we need to maybe understand easier. And talking about the damage that's been done or the damage, the crisis that we're facing, particularly the current exhibition outside. In the future, as the crisis deepens, where do you think there is more value for that art and science collaboration in communicating what's going on? Is it in, how do we get people to act more rather than react to what's going on? Or is it in that, I think as Kit spoke about, that sort of well-being and wellness and keeping people positive and providing active hope? Which one of those do you think might provide more value? And it's for all the panellists.
I suppose I've spent a lifetime, it feels a long lifetime, maybe 30 years working in the arts, and I've really only come to this work in the last 7 years. But what I do know is in the socially engaged space is when we feel something or we react to something viscerally, in this context, we often take action. It engages us. We think about the ideas and the issues, and we may change our behaviour. It's incredibly hard to quantify that, as you know. But that's how we operate as humans. We have to feel and empathise with a situation. So for me, I think the artists and the creative voices and these collaborations between designers, kids, everybody are incredibly interesting place to unpack. I do think the messaging in climate change generally over the years has been pretty wrong in a lot of ways because it hasn't moved the community, but we're up against the vested interests of greed and the 1% who are making so much money it's beyond the pale. But we have to talk about all of these things and we have to be open to discussing this. And what it is about the arts that I so love, the gallery is considered, Australia Council, 1 million surveys about this. The gallery is considered by people a trusted space. When you go in there, people feel like you can be standing next to a CEO, a school kid, or blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter, but it's considered a trusted space and there's an element of truth-saying going on in that trusted space. That's why I like working on these exhibitions. I think, if I could just be very quick, I commissioned a group of artists to make a work in the Latrobe Valley, and it was about changing from the SEC coal culture to a clean and renewable and something future, and it also looked at the fires that were happening there. It was really difficult because we had, Tony Abbott riding around on his bicycle with the Monash group at the time. But what we did is we went and worked with the community. So there was about 50 active players all talking about this before the show went up. So it was pretty well received. But it's a weird kind of place we find ourselves. We're all going to walk out the door now, and it's a beautiful autumnal day. But I can tell you, when Hazelwood was coughing, when you're standing on the train station of Morwell and you get your app out for the air quality, it says poor. Now, you and I, we don't live there, and we've probably got the means not to live there, so we'd take our family away. But a lot of people aren't in that situation. And so we really need as many voices to this as we can. That's my view. And the arts are formative in that for me. Kit, do you want to say something there?
Very briefly, Bronwyn, I think you've described it beautifully. I think we are seeing modes of artistic practice that are increasingly, can I say, broad, collaborative. They do involve whole community, different demographics, different disciplines. It's no longer necessarily a gallery-based practice. It's a very simplistic way of describing it. Supporting that, find tools and frameworks that enable that training, our students in that, emerging practitioners as they come through, is critical. And on that point, at RMIT, again, we're desperately trying to, and the students themselves are asking for skills and understanding in ethical practices. Design is an obvious one where it's a given that any design brief that's provided to the future generation of designers currently in the university has a sustainable framework. The artists similarly are looking increasingly for how they can contribute. And so I think this phenomena of socially engaged practice, if I call it that, needs to be given as much oxygen as possible.
All right, is there any more questions? One more?
Very short, just to let you know that I'm an architect and urban designer. So I'm looking at the buildings in the city, in the CBD, which are beautiful, right? High-rise buildings, different materials, but none of them are giving a piece of green, which any kind of, to the environment. For example, if we say for every 100 square meters of footprint of the building, give me 10 square meters of green, either per floor, open to the air, or a communal open space in greening on the roof. Something that brings back all the emission that this building had taken or still taking. So none of them, I'm trying to deal with it for years. Now in the last 10 years, I'm doing some art painting for myself and I collaborate inside, and people suddenly see that and they said, oh yeah, this is the conflict between two things. One is money for the building and one is money for the energy. So yeah, I think councils and others, CSIRO and others, they have to take it on board.
Oh, I concur. And I would say that the City of Melbourne are doing a couple of things in tracking heat islands across the city. Their council house 2 in Little Collins Street is a completely self-sustaining building. It's quite incredible. But I agree with you, much more has to be done. Is there one more question there?
But there's actually another resource group. There's another resource group, and it's people like me who are actually in science, who are very interested and committed and interested in the arts. And there's a huge number of people out there, I'm in healthcare, but a huge number of people interested who are working in science and healthcare and other related fields that are actually really motivated to get involved in the arts. And I think they somehow need to all come together. I mean, I've got a kind of a network, but there's just a whole group of people that are untapped as a resource that are actually science-based, wanting to engage with the arts, which is kind of the opposite of the artists wanting to engage with the sciences.
Well, what we're kind of talking about is to get out of our silos here. We are saying it's an all-in approach, but, you know, artist-led projects, but working with everybody. Fiona Armstrong from the Climate and Health Alliance is on our board at CLIMART, and she's done some CAHA, and she's done some amazing, amazing work. But please sign up to our website, our newsletter on climart.org. We have been in a very difficult situation during COVID and we've lost a lot of our work, but we're looking to get a space now in Richmond, which is likely to happen, and we're just building a new website. So I think we're going to, hopefully by middle of the year, come forward. But do sign up, because we're always looking for interested people involved in these things. Look, that draws our session to a close. Thank you all so much for coming. Can you please join with me and thank David Karoly, the fabulous Debbie Symons, and Kit Weiss. Please tell everybody you know to come and see the wonderful Sing. It is a really beautiful show to stay with and sit with and listen to how many species of bird calls there?
About 50.
Wow. So this has been made possible by the Copyright Council.
Copyright Council and Bayside Council.
And Bayside, and thank you to Joanna and Helen and all at Bayside and everybody who's worked to put this together today. Thanks very much and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.